On April 21st, 2001, so 20 years ago to the week, Lisa Miller wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, and it was entitled, Redefining God. In the article, she described a new trend, how people were defining God to their own definition. And she had stated, across the country, the faithful are redefining God. Dissatisfied with conventional images of an authoritarian or paternalistic deity, some people are embracing quirky, individualistic conceptions of God to suit their own spiritual needs. They're cobbling together a spiritual life from a variety of religious influences, along with a dash of yoga and psychotherapy or whatever else moves them. Practically what this meant, Lisa Miller would write, was that people were coming up with interesting notions of God. And so for some, like she mentioned the Reverend James Forbes, a New York minister, his concept of God was, quote, a force field of positive energy. For Danny Goldberg, a self-professing Jew, as well as a CEO of a fairly large record company, he would define God as, quote, pure love or an intense feeling of love. Dana Buchman, a fashion designer and Presbyterian church attendee, described what she believed this way. I don't believe in God, but I think often of close relatives who've had an effect on my life and values, and so it's like ancestor worship. If that was 20 years ago, then the case today is even more so. That you have your definitions of who God is, and I have mine. And if that makes you happy, that's great, because I'll go with what makes me happy. And if you choose a God or no God, or if you just don't care, then great. And now you can have your truth, and I can have mine, and as a result of that, well, we can all just have our own concepts and notions of what we want. The book of Judges really describes how a society gets to the place where we're at today. How do you get to the place where everyone has their own individualistic sense of what they want to believe and what they think is right and what is true, and that your definitions of truth and my definitions of truth, they don't have to align, doesn't matter. The book of Judges can really be summed up by the phrase that it uses over and over again, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This individualistic notion is what Judges is all about. Everyone seeking to do what they want to do, what's right in their own eyes. Your truth is yours, my truth is mine. And Judges chapter 2 is a summary of really the entire book. It pulls together all of the pieces of what is about to take place in the history of Israel. It sums it all up for us, and it describes what the situation is like after the death of their great leader Joshua. Joshua, who had been appointed by Moses to take the people into the promised land, who had given the people instructions how to settle the land, has now died, we're told in verse 8, and the nation begins a cycle that is downward and downward and downward. It's a spiraling downward. And each generation and each cycle gets a little bit worse than the one before. That, as we saw at the end of our passage, that the people, that whenever they turned away from the judge, they were more corrupt than their fathers were. More corrupt than the previous generation, as verse 19 says. So how is it that a society falls? And what hope is there? These are important questions that we need to wrestle with in our day. And there's a lot here in the book of Judges, and specifically in Judges 2, that starts to give us some indications as to how societies fall and what hope there is. And so I want us to see two things. And the first thing I want us to see is that you don't forget the Lord. This is always the beginning of the downward cycle of every society. We're told at the beginning of this section that the people of Israel arose And there was a generation who died, and then after them did not know the Lord or the work that he had done. Verse 10. So what we know is that there were people who had come with Joshua into the promised land, and they had been born maybe as young children, late teens, up to the age of about 20, and they had been born in Egypt, and they had remembered that night when God had passed over with that angel of death, and they had seen their parents paint the doorposts with the blood of the lamb, and they had eaten the unleavened bread, and they had fled from Egypt out of fear for their lives to go and worship the Lord, that Pharaoh had chased after them, and as an entire nation they had been pressed up against the Red Sea until the cloud of the Lord descended, and he blocked the way from Pharaoh and his chariots from coming to the people of Israel. And through that, the wind blew and opened a path through the sea so that the people of Israel could walk through on dry land. And as they walked through, they saw the waves crash over the Egyptian army, and they had moved into the wilderness and gone to Mount Sinai, where God had descended in power and glory, thundering on the mountain. Moses had gone up to meet the Lord, and while he had been up there, he had received the 10 Commandments. And while he had received those commandments, the people then began to grumble, they began to complain, but over and over and over, God provided food and water all the time for his people as they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. And now as they had come with Joshua to the edge of the promised land, Moses dying, Joshua leading them, just like he had opened the Red Sea, the Lord parted the Jordan River, and across they went on dry ground, and they had conquered the land. They had seen God give them the cities of Jericho, the walls collapsing, Ai, and the plunder being received, and all of the rest of the territories. And so they had received these great blessings. They had experienced the power of God, and they had found their land, the land that God had promised to Abraham. But we're told that that generation died, and another generation arose, and that generation did not know two things. They did not know the Lord, and they did not know the works of the Lord. Now, what does that mean, that they did not know the Lord? Well, it doesn't mean that they had no concept of their history. It doesn't mean that they had forgotten about what happened in Egypt or the Red Sea or the Jordan River or Mount Sinai or Jericho. But what that word means when it says they did not know is that they had no relationship with God. That had been good for their parents and for their ancestors, and it had worked for them, but that wasn't necessary now for them. And when it says that they did not know the works of the Lord, it means that they had not known his miraculous saving power. Oh, they knew the stories, but they didn't know the saving power of God in their lives. And as a result of that, as they went into the land, we're told in Judges chapter 1, as they went into the land, they started at the south, and all of the tribes working together, they fought, they secured Judah's territory, and Judah got a hold of their territory. But they didn't cast out the other nations, and they had allowed the worldliness of other nations to just carry on. And not only then, but as they move further north, by the time you get to the last tribe, the tribe of Dan, what we find out is that Dan is not able to conquer the land, but they live oppressing the peoples who are there, and they live in the hills. And as a result of that, they do not know peace. They have these worldly influences all around them. They were to devote to destruction the nations so that their hearts would not be led astray. But because they hadn't done that, well, slowly over time they discovered these Canaanite folks are kind of nice. These Amorites, that's the general term for the people who live in the land, they're not so bad. And the Canaanites would invite them to, their services that they were having. Here, we've got some great business practices that could really help you out. We could really help you with your farming. And there's different practices than what you've known, and the ways here are different. So they would teach them the ways of how to have a successful farming business and how to have fruit that grew in abundance. And the way that they did that was that they had their own gods. They had their Baals and their Ashtaroths. And Baal was the male deity, Ashtaroth was the female deity, and in the ancient world, the gods of the ancient world would intermingle and have relations, and out of their relations with one another would flow the abundance of fertility. And this fertility would produce good crops. And so what you had to do then was that you had to participate in the worship of those gods to provoke them to perform their connection, their relational connection. And so you would do all sorts of things that were highly inappropriate, that we won't even talk about, which is why in verse 17 it talks about they hoard after their gods. This is the practice of the ancient world, that you provoke the deities to be fertile and produce for you. And so this is exactly what Israel did. And over time, they developed a spiritual amnesia. Now, spiritual amnesia did not happen all at once. It wasn't that they woke up one morning and they forgot the Lord. But over a long, slow, steady period, with one little compromise and another and another and another, Israel forgot the Lord. It was this frog in the kettle type syndrome. You put the frog in the pot and you turn the water on, and as the water heats up, the frog adjusts to the temperature so that by the time it reaches the point of boiling, the frog has not even realized that it has adjusted itself to death. And this is what Israel had done. They had adjusted to the nations. They had adapted their worldly practices. And as a result of that, they had found that the gods, we are told, that the gods of the nations enslaved them. Verse 14, they could no longer withstand their enemies. They were oppressed. The freedom that the other gods offered was no freedom at all. Because this is what idols do. Idols, you fashion them in your own image, but what you discover about an idol is that as you fashioned it in your own image, it doesn't set you free, it enslaves you to them. And this is the cycle of every society that has fallen. It starts off, it grows in affluence, it grows in success, and people say, I've gotten this by myself. Why do I need God? And over time, there grows an anxiety. You can have your truth, and I can have mine. We have our own morals, which leads to corruption. And what corruption leads to is a lack of trust, and it causes a society to disintegrate from within. The people turn on one another, and it comes to its decline, and people then say, where's God? Where is he? God has designed the world with a circuit breaker in it. He's designed the world so that the circuit breaker trips when you try to enjoy all of the good gifts of God without God. He's designed it so that you can't have just comfort and ease and pleasure but not have God. God is not the God who wants to have your hand in his pocket but not care about his heart. That God wants your heart and he wants to know you. And so God will not be forgotten, which is what verse 15 indicates. It indicates that whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them, that the Lord had warned them, that the Lord had sworn this, that God will not be forgotten. This is his circuit breaker that trips when we forget God. And as a result of that, there is no good gift without God. That you can have all of the pleasures and good gifts of the world, but if you don't have God, you will lose your soul. And people want to gain the world, but they lose their soul in the process. And the warning here of the book of Judges is don't forget the Lord. Don't forget him when it's good, and don't forget him when it's hard. He wants your heart, and he will not be forgotten. And so as societies go through this cycle, it raises the question, is there any hope? Is there any hope? To which we find in verse 16 that the Lord does show mercy and compassion. In verse 18, we're told that he has pity on his people. that they cry out in distress. We're told at the end of verse 15 that the people were in terrible distress. And what does the Lord do? He raises up judges. And as the people cry out in their distress, which we hear in verse 18, the Lord hears that cry. And this crying out to the Lord ought to remind us of Psalm 107, where in the cycle of Israel's history, of this downward spiral as they continued to get worse and worse and fall away, that there was this crying out to the Lord. And as Psalm 107 says, and they cried out to the Lord in their anguish, and he answered them in their distress. This is how God has worked. He has heard the cries of his people. He has had compassion upon his people, and he responds in mercy. And the way that he responds is by providing judges. Now, when we think of judges, we think of people who are sitting on a bench in a court of law. But that's not what a judge here is. A judge in the book of Judges is a military leader. It's a person who goes to overthrow the oppressor, who casts them off, who raises up a people and an army to overthrow those who have oppressed them. And throughout the book of Judges, we hear of Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Barak, Gideon, and Samson. And we'll look at Samson next week. And these leaders, as much as they are raised up and they're given the power of the Spirit, they increasingly are compromised leaders. They don't have full integrity. They don't treat women with respect. They lack the kind of character that a nation needs. And as a result of these flawed leaders, what we see is that, well, as long as the leader is there, Israel will follow. Israel will obey. They'll do what the leader says. But as verse 19 describes, as every leader dies off, Israel finds itself going back to its own vomit, and it finds itself even worse than it was before. That this cycle just continues in a downward spiral. Once the commander is gone, the circumstances go back to the same. And so often, this is precisely how people act. They think, if we can just change our outward circumstances, if someone could just change what's going on out there, then everything in here would be okay. And so people try to change churches or jobs or marriages or relationships or houses or communities, or they do all sorts of things to change their outward circumstances in the hopes that something inward would change. And what they find, inevitably, is that the problems that existed over there now exist here too. Because the problems don't merely follow you, the problems are within you. There's something, yeah, there can be difficult people and there can be difficult circumstances, but what about me? What about my heart? And as much as Israel was trying to cast off the bad circumstances, they found themselves in the same circumstances over and over again, because the problem wasn't the changed circumstance, the problem was an unchanged heart. It was a heart that would not follow God. This is why when Lisa Miller concluded her article in the Wall Street Journal, she said, "These gentler, almost mystical forms of theology have found a receptive audience in today's affluent society. These are relatively peaceful and prosperous times. So even as many Americans search for deeper connections with God, they aren't facing the kinds of crises that often prompt people to seek protection or salvation from above. Tough times or sudden hardships could change all this in a hurry. No matter how broad or far-flung people's conceptions of God, they revert to God the Father when the going gets tough." You see, trials and difficulties come and they shatter our gods. They show that they're powerless. And they cause us to cry out in anguish. And when we cry out to God in our anguish, as verse 18 says, he answers out of pity, out of compassion, out of mercy. And in this responsive mercy, we find that we need more than a change of circumstance. We need a change of heart. And the change of heart comes as we see the glory of Christ. Because every story of the Old Testament is pointing us to the glory of the one who is the true deliverer, who is coming for us. For 1,200 years later, another deliverer would come. But there would be the people of God facing the same kind of oppression. Not the oppression of the Amorites and Canaanites, but the oppression of the Romans, who had oppressed them and charged them exorbitant taxes and given the people of Israel great grief. And they had cried out for a deliverer. And finally there was one who would come. And we're told in Matthew 1, verse 21, that this one who is coming, his name shall be called Jesus. Yeshua. Sounds like Joshua. For he will save his people from their sins. That the oppression that people experienced was not merely the oppression outwardly of Rome, though Rome was certainly oppressive and wicked in many ways. But what was needed was an inward transformation and salvation. And this man, Jesus, who comes as this new Joshua, this new deliverer, this new person to bring his people into the promised land, who does not die a final death. He comes, but he doesn't overthrow Romans the way that everybody thinks that they should be overthrown. He says, pay to Caesar the taxes that are due to Caesar and give to God what is due to God. To the religious leaders who say, tear down this temple, and Jesus says, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And the scribes and the Pharisees can't believe what he says. Jesus does not focus on the outward, but he focuses on a greater reality. But this focus on a greater reality leads him to a cross where he is crucified and killed. And it looks like he is defeated. But in the defeat of God comes the defeat of sin and death. That he conquers sin and death by not staying dead like Joshua, the first Joshua did, but by rising again. And as he rises again, he defeats the gods of this age who promise happiness but never deliver, who give enslavement and only cause greater grief. And he comes and he overthrows the oppressor, and he overthrows sin and death, and he says that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, as Paul will quote in Romans 10:13. And this overthrowing of sin and death means that by faith we know that God has loved us and given his Son for us so that we could live the life now in the flesh by faith in that Son who overthrew sin and death. And because he has overthrown sin and death, Paul will say in Galatians 5, verse 1, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. So don't go back again to the yoke of slavery. And this is what the gods of this world will do. They'll promise you everything, but they'll never deliver. But Jesus, he says that if you lose your life, you will gain it. And that if you lose your life and you find him, you have found the pearl of greatest price, the treasure that is worth all. And when you know that, when you know of his saving power to deliver you, then you can wait for him, and you can cry out, and you can trust him in the hardest of days, knowing that the best is yet to come.